Hey everybody, today is Monday, September 8th, 2025. Coming up on the show today, from Weapons, editor Joe Murphy.
I like to go into a movie with just enough information to get started on the first cut, but to really keep myself as clean as possible to be the first set of eyes on the dailies. The challenge is really the experience of watching the film when you introduce a new character 6 times throughout the film that we're going to be announcing their perspective. It becomes a big pacing challenge. As you progress in the film and you're racing towards the curtain, you should be picking up the pace, getting less and less exposition, and just trying to be mindful of the cumulative effect of watching something for 2 hours.
Yes, all that and more on this edition of The Rough Cut. Hey gang, Matt Fury here, your faithful post-production correspondent. If only my high school guidance counselor could see me now. But forget him, this show is all about you. And I got a question for you. Are you up for talking about scary things? I know, what's scarier than working in post-production right now? I get it, things are tough. Hang in there. No, what I mean is, are you up for talking about editing scary things? Because if you are, your ghost ship has come in. Today we have none other than Joe Murphy, the editor of the horror hit Weapons. And I know for a fact, whether you like to be scared or not, you are going to enjoy and get a lot out of what Joe has to say. And also what he doesn't say. In many ways, Joe's philosophy is to leave things open to interpretation and not necessarily give the audience all the answers. But when he does have something to say, he really drops the science on storytelling. So I'm going to take a page out of Joe's book and not get into a big discussion of Joe's background or what Weapons is all about. If you've seen it, you've seen it. And if you haven't, you should see it. And if you just don't like scary movies, then go Google Weapons and get a quick overview before we dive into this talk with Joe. But don't you dare do that while I'm doing my sponsor ad. What sponsor ad? Well, this one. My friends, if you want a really good scare, try telling a great story without great production audio to back it up. Music is everything when it comes to setting the mood, managing the pace, and just making movie magic in general. Which is why you need to see those musical magicians at Extreme Music. They've built an enormous library of original music from top-tier composers from around the world. And more importantly, they've made it smart, really smart to navigate. First, doing a classic search using musical metadata. Everything from tempo and instrumentation to composer and mood. Second, describe your scene or the emotion you're trying to convey, and let their artful intelligence come back with tracks that hit the mark. And third, this could not be easier, just upload a reference track to Extreme Music and let their system find songs that match its vibe, so you're not starting from scratch. Extreme Music also gives you tools like their amazing stem mixer, which lets you dial in the instruments you want. And do not forget their super straightforward licensing. No headaches, no hoops to jump through, just premium production music served up quick and easy. So if you're working in film or TV and you want your soundtrack to sound its very best, you gotta go see those musical masters at Extreme Music. Okay, time for things to get spooky here on the podcast. I promise no actual jump scares, just lots of talk about them. And here to do the talking is Weapons editor Joe Murphy. I got another one for you.
Okay, go for it, yeah.
Luckily, we're here and we're recording this. So even though we're here to talk about Weapons, I think we need to back up at least one big film with Zach and talk about you meeting director Zach Cregger. As I said, this is not your first time cutting for him. So tell me about that initial meeting with him and getting the gig for Barbarian.
Zach was overseas prepping to shoot Barbarian, actually, and while he was doing prep, he was interviewing editors. We met over Zoom. You know, when you meet with the director as an editor, you're really trying to check, particularly from the director's point of view, there's a chemistry check. You know, is this someone that I think that I could spend a lot of time with and that we have something simpatico creatively, and trying to figure out how we're going to collaborate. It's a process that you have to be able to be both very frank and direct and also very supportive. You know, you're really trying to help the director best articulate their vision. If I'm close to getting a film or working with someone, I generally can kind of tell by the interview if we continue to talk, if the conversation seems like we have to kind of cut it off because someone has to go, or there is some sort of like energy between the two of you where you're able to bounce ideas off each other and there's an ease and a flow to the initial meeting. And so I think that in terms of my case with Zach, we definitely hit it off. a really easy flowing conversation. We were just chatting about movies in general. And, I'd recently rewatched The Birds, and I had broke down a scene for him from The Birds, just talking about the use of suspense and surprise. So we kind of chatted about that for a while and like just the shot structure there. And one of the things that was so nice about that one scene, it's the scene where Jessica Tandy, I don't know if you remember the scene in particular, Jessica Tandy finds the dead farmer. It's a super famous scene. And really, the horror in that scene actually is really constructed through both the lead up to the reveal of the farmer and then this brilliant reaction of hers where she doesn't even scream. And we hold with her as she's running from the house and getting in the car and running back to her place in the car, and there's not even like a barely an audible reaction from her, just breath. And I think it's a really great example of how something can be truly scary, both the setup and then also the reaction to it. It's done in a very inventive way, obviously. But our conversation went really well, and I got off that meeting with him, and I was hoping that I would get an offer on the film. And thankfully, I did, and we got to work together. So that was great.
Fast forward to Weapons, and you guys already have that familiarity and that comfort. What did he say to you about this film and what he wanted to do with Weapons?
I read the script for Weapons before they had shot it, and it really grabbed me. I think having worked together with Zach before, I sort of have a sense of his sensibility. And we didn't really get into too many things about the cut or the philosophy behind the edit before we started. One of the things for me, I like to go into a movie with just enough information to get started on the first cut, but to really keep myself as clean as possible to be the first set of eyes on the dailies. I mean, obviously, every film has different requirements. Sometimes you're going to have to review storyboards. You're going to have to maybe look at some kind of previs for like an action sequence or something. But in general, for me, like after reading the script, I really want to put it away and just look at the dailies as they come in and just respond. And be able to look at a scene and just find what is interesting about it for me. And really try to focus on that during the first cut. And hopefully also start to intuit as I work through the cut what the director and the DP are trying to do. And I start to learn the language that they're working with for this specific film. I think that's one of the reasons why I like to keep myself just as bare minimum information as possible. I did have one question for Zach while they were shooting. I asked him about what his plan was with transitions between scenes or sometimes within a scene between like shot to shot. And he did mention to me, he's like, I don't remember his exact words, but the transitions were going to be really aggressive. So this wasn't a film that we're going to be having smooth cuts where we have abruptness to a number of the transitions. And that's something I did take into the assembly to keep in the back of my mind. I don't necessarily want to ease us in between scenes. Sometimes we're going to actually rip the audience from one scene to another. And I think you can see that in the final version of the film.
In the lead up to Weapons, I had heard several different genres being ascribed to it. Certainly horror, but also mystery, supernatural thriller. And now that it's been out a little bit, I think the term dark comedy has crept in, shall we say. Above all else, what is it to you? How do you describe Weapons?
I still think of Weapons as a horror movie to me. I mean, I know it has elements of thriller and there's an element of dark comedy woven throughout the film. But for me, it definitely is first and foremost a horror movie. I do think that when you have a film that does have touches of multiple genres in it, I think there can be a desire to want to pin stuff down for an audience sometimes. Like it may be easier to understand and read the film if you're trying to understand it. Like, oh, this is really a thriller, or this is a supernatural movie. And that's sort of how I can sink my teeth into it, But I think that these different genres, they're just, I kind of use the example for me as like, it's not necessarily a genre thing for me, but more of like, if you want to show color in a scene, like if you want to have the color red really pop in a scene and everything is red, you always have to have a reference of a white point. And so your eye always needs some sort of contrast or reference point to understand something. Like a lot of times for me, like say the best dramas that are most realistic will always have elements of comedy in them. You don't want to have a drama that's just a straight drama where you don't laugh the entire time. I mean, you can obviously, but usually you need those other elements of contrast to understand and appreciate and process what is the dominant force in something, right? So I do think that those other genre components contribute to Weapons as a horror film. But it's really up for interpretation. I'm definitely not the definitive answer on this, but that's just my way of looking at it.
I think being the editor, I think your way of looking at it's a pretty good one. Since you brought up reference points, I'll follow up on that. Zach has cited Magnolia, of all films, as being a reference point for weapons. I just wonder if you could explain that and share possibly any other films or points of reference he might have given to you.
I know, it's so funny. I wish I had much to say on Magnolia, but we just didn't really talk about other films as a reference between the two of us. I know that Zach and his cinematographer, Larkin Siepel, they had stuff that they were referencing. I'm just not privy to some of those films that they were talking about, And again, for me, it's still one of those things that I kind of almost don't want to know. Not because it's not going to be inspirational for me, but it's still, again, wanting to stay as fresh as possible for the director to really be that first set of eyes. So even if something is an homage to another movie, I can find out about that later, and not necessarily have the conversation up front.
Okay, so once you read the script, you're into it and you want to do it, what do you do next to prep for it?
One of the things I do, and this is beyond just prepping, just because I like to go to the movies, I will watch a lot of movies, but I definitely will watch movies specifically in the genre that I'm going to be working in. And I try to see them with friends. So what I like to do is go to a movie either in the theaters or watch it at home, watch it with other people, and then talk about it afterwards. And there's always something I can use for reference where I can find a scene that I can break down and try to understand how the editing worked in that scene so I could apply that as a technique or inspiration for something I'm doing. But I actually really try to look at the overall arc of the film and really try to get inside what the director was trying to do. Part of that for me is looking at the opening of the film and the ending of the movie and seeing where we started out and where the director left us at the very end, and just trying to understand what their vision for something was and what they were trying to say. Was the movie enjoyable? Was it slow parts for people? Just kind of break it down with other folks. And I find that to be the most helpful thing for me. It's definitely really good prep work. It's again, I'm always trying to kind of toggle between the micro work I have to do editorially with working on shots and scenes and rhythm and that kind of stuff, but also the big picture, which again, my thing really for how I can be most helpful for the director is how I can really help them hone in and articulate their vision. And I want to be looking at a lot of other movies to be able to start to figure that out too. And what I see on the screen without knowing how it was put together at all, without knowing the dailies, what am I left with? And I was going to do this anyway and watch all these movies, but I'll refocus it more for the genre specifically. So I'll try to include more horror movies in my regular viewing schedule than say I normally would.
I'd love to know where the film was shot and where you were cutting, whether or not you were on location or remote from Zach.
The film was shot in Atlanta and we were cutting in New York City. We cut at Postworks in New York. So I was remote, but at least we were in the same time zone. If there was a question or anything, it was pretty easy to hop on the phone and share a scene over something like Pix or whatever and talk about it. One of the things that was so great about this movie is that New Line was the main company behind the film, and they had a setup for post for us where their recommendation was everyone's on the same floor, we're all together, and it was really great to have that environment where we had VFX, our assistant editors, Max Berger and Josephine Wilwright, our composers, Ryan and Hayes Holiday, our music editor, Lightchild, and downstairs we had our sound mixer and sound editor as well. So it was a really collaborative environment because of that. It made it a lot of fun to be there in post and made things efficient. It was much easier to grab someone to show them something and get their feedback on it, or to say, give feedback to VFX because they're down the hall, or sit and work with the composers because they're in another room making music for the movie, next door to you. So that made the environment look very creative.
Was it important you were all together because the film was so scary?
I mean, yeah, I think that did actually help.
I would not want to be cutting this film alone by myself. Some creaky old post house.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's just me. I'm almost going to assume, based on some of the things you've said to me already, like being removed from certain things, that for you, you don't want to know what went into the production of a shot. But I'll ask anyway, if it's up to you, would you want to be on location or remote?
It's really what the needs of the director and the production are. If they need me there because for whatever reason they think is best, I'm down and I will make it work. But part of what I think is helpful is if, say you have a really difficult day of shooting, I get the dailies. I don't know it was a difficult day of shooting. And I look at this scene and I can be like, wow, this scene is amazing. Whereas the entire team may be thinking, oh man, that shoot day was so hard. Did we actually get the scene we needed? And I think it's actually a little bit more helpful when I'm not necessarily in the thick of things. It's helpful for me to be more of a neutral arbiter there. That being said, sometimes you want to be on set, or close to set at least, and that in-person contact with someone, particularly if you need to provide support to your director for something, can be very valuable for them. So I'm definitely not opposed to that. It is one of those things for me that I think not knowing about how difficult it was to, say, get a certain shot, or if everything seemed to fall apart on that day, because sometimes when you get the footage back and something is really fantastic, but it may be harder for those working on the crew to see that given the challenges they may have faced getting that footage.
And what was the schedule behind the production and post process?
So for Weapons, I believe they had 51 days of shooting, give or take a day or two. Zach had a standard 10 weeks of director's cut. We were really close to locking picture before we finished the director's cut, actually. We had some friends and family screenings that went really well. And then after our first preview, it was one of those things where we just had refinements left to do. I don't remember how long the remaining parts of post were. With VFX and with the refinement time, and it was much longer than that after Zach's director's cut before we actually officially finished the film, but it didn't change drastically after those 10 weeks.
There's so many interesting aspects for us to talk about. First thing I want to talk about is just structure. Building the film in chapters. You build it around, let's see, 6 characters, the main characters of the film.
Yeah.
And then you sort of reveal different elements of their shared story over time. I'd love to know what kind of challenges that construct might have had on the editing process.
It's actually kind of interesting. I think the challenge is really the experience of watching the film when you introduce a new character 6 times throughout the film that we're going to be announcing their perspective. It becomes a big pacing challenge. Zach did a lot of this work in the script already where we didn't have a ton of scenes that were cut out of the movie, actually. He didn't shoot everything from every character's perspective, for instance. That was already designed, what he wanted to replay and not. Obviously, we did make a few changes there, but it was conceived of initially, like how he wanted to intro these characters and what moments he wanted to pick up from their other stories and flash to when we get to different perspectives. But there is this thing when you're watching it, you're trying to figure out how to pace the opening of each chapter, because you do need a little bit of get to know you time. You need to kind of hook into these characters. You need to get a sense of them, some things about their backstory. We need some moments to understand them, to start off this new journey we're going to go on with them in each chapter. But you also run into the problem where your audience can really start to lose patience with that. So I think we had to find a balance pacing-wise and also figure out what minor trims we could make to get just enough of a taste of each character while getting to know them a little bit to help us hook in and invest in them for their specific chapter. That was really the challenge that I think that we faced with that chapter structure. One of the things that we discovered in some of our feedback screenings was that there were a few scenes that we did replay from, say, Justine's perspective and Alex's perspective, where Justine confronts Alex, for instance, outside of his house. We had the whole scene replayed originally in Alex's chapter from Alex's side, where she confronts him. Stuff like that we found we didn't really need, was starting to bog down the story that late in the film. There is that kind of classic thing that you always talk about pacing-wise. As you progress in the film and you're racing towards the curtain, you should be picking up the pace, getting less and less exposition, and just trying to be mindful of the cumulative effect of watching something for 2 hours. How the audience really doesn't need that much to really understand what's going on.
We talked about the different genres you could describe to Weapons. It is a mystery, too. And going back to that structure where we have all these different perspectives that we're going through, in the end, 2 + 2 + 2 + 2 + 2 needs to equal 10. I hope I got that right. Boy, won't that be embarrassing if I missed that one? But it does all have to add up, and the logic has to make sense as much as a supernatural thriller can. Is that something you have to be mindful of as well? Or maybe it came through in the audience screenings where you almost have to do a logic pass so that in the end, looking back, you're playing fair with the audience on a mystery aspect?
I think that's an interesting question, actually, because again, so much of that was worked out in the script prior and then executed on set. So we already kind of really had the structure and the bones for that. It was actually more of sense of, is the audience emotionally engaged in each chapter? Not so much the forensics of the mystery. Obviously when you do an audience screening, you kind of get some questions to see like, is there anything that's really tripping people up? Is there something they really want to know more about, for instance? But sometimes those questions about knowledge about something actually is because maybe they're just focusing and they're getting a little bored and they aren't really invested in the movie at that point. So their mind starts wandering to trying to figure out the logic behind something instead of actually just being invested in your characters and what's happening on screen. And so we didn't necessarily have to do a logic pass in that sense, but it was definitely to figure out what was most compelling and truthful in each chapter and honest for like what the characters were going through. The one thing we did do to keep the investigation alive, though, because this was something that was a little bit challenging early on in the movie when we cut to Paul's chapter, we're really not focusing as much on the pursuit of the kids. So we were finding that we wanted to figure out some ways just to keep that beat alive. It wasn't so much anything that we had to do to change that chapter per se, but we just added some elements of the investigation of the hunt for the kids into the background of Paul's chapter. For instance, in the radio when he's driving around doing his patrol, there's a reminder about the investigation that we added on a radio announcement in the car to help keep that beat alive during Paul's section. The key with the mystery is actually not revealing too much, so I think you really want to keep your audience guessing, and I think it can be satisfying without really having to reveal everything.
Well, hearing you say that is inspiring my next question. And again, this is one of those definite hardcore fan questions where it's like, who cares, dude? That's just how he did it. But I want to know.
Okay.
Speaking of Paul,
yeah,
when we're still in Justine's chapter,
yep,
we see a quick cutaway to Paul, who's a cop, in her chapter.
Yeah.
And then later in her chapter, he walks into a bar to meet her. Did we need to know he was a cop before they met in the bar? Why did we need that one cutaway to Paul?
It's funny because to me, it's so important. It sets up her interest in him. It sets up her perspective on that relationship. It's something we return to in his chapter when we see his reaction to her waving at him, which we don't get in her chapter. And then we get his response to that. So we're learning more information about their relationship and their dynamic that way. It also sets up the language of the movie where we're going to learn how one character perceives something. And later on in another chapter, when we replay that scene, we're going to get their perspective on it. And I think between Paul and Justine, actually, we have a number of moments where we see their two sides of the story. And for me, it makes it a lot richer. I really like that beat, actually, because of that.
In that vein, was there a philosophy that you and Zach employed in terms of either, and maybe this goes out the window when you have all these different chapters and different perspectives you're working with, but you always talk about whether or not the audience is aligned with or ahead of the protagonist.
Right.
And I just wondered if you had a philosophy on that, and if you did it evolve at all during post?
Because of how complicated having like 6 interlocking stories, and really honestly like 7, honestly, with the final culmination of the movie when everyone converges on the house, a lot of this was really kind of worked out in the script. I don't really think there was an evolution per se of how we looked at whether or not we're ahead, behind, or with the characters. I think it's something that Zach and again his DP did a lot of work in the design of the movie to figure out where they wanted the camera to be to help us with that in specific moments and scenes. But in terms of our editorial process, I think it was really intrinsic to the design of the movie and how the movie was pre-visualized.
The example that made me think of that was it's a scene where Archer goes to see the police captain to ask him to investigate Justine further.
Yeah.
And the captain defends her and says, that woman has done nothing wrong. And at that point, we don't know that the captain is aware that Justine has slept with his son-in-law, Paul. So we don't get the immediate payoff. I mean, now I could be, when I watch these movies, I'm taking notes.
Yeah, totally. Well, I would say like there's a little misremembering going on here because timeline-wise, so if you think about it like this, we're cutting to, if you accept the fact that each chapter happens in a linear fashion, in Archer's chapter, you're cutting to the school meeting right after that scene with him and the police captain. And that school meeting takes place before Justine and Paul have hooked up. So, because if you remember in Justine's chapter, that kicks off her chapter, the school meeting. Mm-hmm. And that's the same meeting that Archer is attending right after that office interview with the captain.
Marcus, the character Marcus,
yep.
He attacks Justine. I think this was in Marcus's chapter.
Yep.
And it looks like you use some of the same shots as in Justine's chapter. Am I remembering that right? Because I don't really think you did that as a rule going from chapter to chapter. I think it was always different perspectives. So did I remember that right? And was there some reasoning behind that?
Well, you're definitely you're close in the sense that
I'll take close
yeah,
at this point, Joe.
So basically, like, just a little backstory on how they shot, say, the gas station attack. So they were shooting multiple scenes at the same time. They do a camera setup, and I would get stuff slated for, that particular scene. In general, they didn't reuse the same camera setup, but I get a batch of stuff from scenes where I'll say, like, we'll just come up with random numbers here, say 22 and 55. Those are not the scene numbers for that scene, but whatever. I don't remember what they were. So, but, like, I do believe in the gas station attack, the only shot that would have been a repeat would have been Justine getting choked by Marcus. Otherwise, everything was, and that wasn't a repeat because we reused footage. It was shot differently for each scene, but it was from a similar camera angle.
Okay.
So
I feel better.
The rest of so the rest of the scene though is they are camera there were like when they were shooting, they would very clearly label, like, this is for scene 22, we're at the same location, same action, this is scene 55 that you're going to be using from this character's perspective. And it was a challenge sometimes, especially if something shot over multiple days. I'd be assembling something and I don't know what's coming next. So, I may be feeling like I'm missing a shot and I'm like, shoot, do I have to call set? Because why didn't they get that close up? Like, I really want to cut to that close up in scene 22. But the reality is I'm not really supposed to cut to that close up until I get to scene 55, because that's how we're playing that scene. You see what I mean? Like, we're playing that shot in that scene and we're saving that moment and that beat for a later character's perspective. So it was it could be a little bit tricky before the film was completely shot and I saw all the footage and all the pieces. As I was putting together those first cuts, having to really understand and stay true to what was supposed to be in that specific scene. Obviously later on, if we wanted to, we could mix stuff up and reuse footage and do whatever. There's whatever's going to make the movie work. But at least for the initial pass, it was still one of those things to keep in the back of my mind. Like, I may not be using that moment here.
Yeah. Well, a question I almost always ask, and I can't for the life of me figure out why I didn't have it written down for you, again, because of the structure, is organization and how you approach organizing the material. Was Weapons any more challenging, any more difficult than any other film you've done in terms of how you needed to organize the media, the story elements within the Avid? Is there anything unique about Weapons in that regard?
This is where having a really strong editorial team came in. Max Berger and Josephine Wilwright, and then also our post-PA, Yeva Resnick, provided amazing support for this process and getting stuff set up and keeping stuff organized. Max and Josephine, they were kind of my front line for logging everything. So I would rely on them to kind of inform me of anything that may be unique or different about something coming in as their first set of eyes, obviously before I watched everything. But for this movie, normally I would start working in reels right away, but I kept everything organized by character this time until we broke it down into actual quote unquote proper reel lengths later on. It was just easier to say, keep our reels labeled by character and chapter, since that was already the structure that was in the script. So that was one tool I used to organize things. And also, because of the script tool in the Avid, it was very easy for me to compare shots between scenes. So, again, using that scene 22 and 55 example, I could easily toggle between those two different scripts and see the different camera setups and understand how Zach and Larkin were shooting from different perspectives very, very quickly and easily, and see it how it corresponds to on the actual script. So, I rely on that tool quite a bit. It's definitely one of the things that's unique about Avid and super helpful. That was definitely helpful in keeping everything together and organized for us.
So like we talked about earlier, Weapons, it's definitely a horror movie, but it's a lot more. But still, you're going to have your jump scares. And jump scares are like jokes. Once you've heard them or experienced them, a lot of times they just don't hit the same way again. Over the course of editing this film, were there things that you did to try and make sure that this is hitting just as good as it did the first time I saw it?
This is really where your audience screenings are very helpful. And I think for me, if something's funny, it's a little bit easier to keep track of than if something is like, if a jump scare is working. I'll always find myself laughing again and again and again at something, even if it's not a laugh out loud moment. I have this kind of, I think for most of us, it's like those things that kind of tickle you. Even if the sound grows a little bit fainter with each viewing, you always kind of feel it. Having fresh eyes on your scares is going to help point you to whether you've nailed it or whether you need to make some improvements. And that just comes from watching it with people that are uninitiated and don't really know the movie. Something that I think this was kind of already in the design of weapons, but this was something that was important to keep in mind if you're going to have a jump scare that utilizes a specific character in a film. You want to make sure, say like Gladys as our jump scare image, that we see her 3 times in the film before she appears in the principal's office. One of the things that we discovered is that we want to keep those shots as brief as possible, just enough to give the audience a little tease of that image. And this was already visually in there, but it was something that we leaned into, is like, you want to show her differently each time. For instance, if you were doing a movie that had a ghost in it, maybe the first time you see the ghost, you only want to see their arm. Then you may see another part of the body another time. Then you may get a full body shot later on, but you want to keep changing what the reveal is. Having that is something that's actually very helpful to have the scare not feel repetitive. But similar to what we were talking about with that example from the birds earlier, it's the setup and then the payoff, not so much the actual jump scare moment, that really makes something work, I think. I don't know if there's any like kind of best practices for jump scares. I do think that you can try stuff with sound. I mean, obviously like a great sting can be helpful, but it's one of those things that things can start to feel repetitive if you use the same device over and over again. So if you're working with the element of surprise, you don't want to tip your audience off to what you're doing, so you got to be careful with that too. And just be mindful of like, something we do in this reveal of the parents sitting on the couch. Justine, she walks through the backyard and kind of this heightened kind of sounds of the backyard there. But then when she gets close to the window, the sound drops down and we're more in her perspective, what it's like to peer through glass. The sound drops down and then we get the reveal, a scare for the parents. And we have her reaction to that with the, that kind of big crash on the rake and everything else that's right behind her. You wouldn't want to necessarily repeat. I mean, you could, but you want to be careful at repeating that sound device as the lead up to a scare where let's make everything really quiet before we get one big sting. Your audience is going to be clued into that pretty quickly. And then they're going to be anticipating the surprise. And if the twist doesn't hit them, you're in dangerous territory. Again, it's something you never want to have any rules for anything. Honestly, I think that's always like it's always where things can get kind of like sticky. But definitely just be aware of how you're repeating things and how you're tipping off your audience. And to keep that suspense and surprise going, I think that's something just to keep in the back of your mind. Like maybe try a different way with your sound. If you tried one device before, see if you can vary it up the next time.
Well, first, Joe, I have to correct you about something, and that is you see Gladys 3 times if you keep your eyes open. So I missed the first 2 because I just couldn't, I did not want to see what Archer was about to see or Justin was. So I just saw her once, but that's just me. Hopefully the rest of the world is a lot braver than I am. Okay, so you gave a great answer about just not wanting to be repetitive or really fall into the trap of any best practices. And I can see why, because I tried this a few weeks ago on the comedy side for The Naked Gun. Same idea. It's like, let me try out to try these things. And my hit rate was very poor. Yet I'm still going to just throw caution to the wind and say, well, what do you think of these, Joe? Have you ever done any of these? And you can say, I just told you, dude, I don't do that. Or not. We'll find out.
Okay.
These are culled from years of talking to editors about horror.
Yeah.
Coming out from a close-up or jumping in from a wide shot in terms of just changing the framing, something that you like to do, don't do, think it's cliche?
No, I mean, I think that's a great technique. But I'd be curious about how that's attached to someone's point of view, for instance. Are you experiencing that through a character, or is this just a visual device to sort of create something jarring? I mean, sometimes I think we can confuse something being a jump scare with just something that jars the audience, and I think it needs to be more than that. But I don't think any of these things are bad things to try out, Varying your shot could be the perfect way to create that scare.
Let's lean into the sound part a little bit. So how about L cutting the sound effect so that it leads the scare, or any other techniques related to sound? I mean, you talked about the background noise. Any other techniques that you use with sound?
I do think that depending on the type of scare, do you have a sting on the cut or not? That can really create a really nice moment. Whatever type of sound effect you're using on that cut, on the shot that is the scare itself. But you also may not need that too. It's, again, I just don't, I mean, there are things you always kind of maybe want to start out and try and see. I just think sometimes what happens is that with our current state of cutting and filmmaking, everything else, it's really easy to experiment. We're doing everything digitally and it's very easy just to try stuff out, but that could also lead to you layering stuff on. And I think that trying to figure out what the simplest way to do something is usually going to be the best way. You can always add more layers if you need to. But I would see is, can you make something work and make something scary before you try some kind of enhancement techniques? And that could just be by a cut, like a cut to from a wide to a close or close to a wide or something. That could really reveal it. That would be my first approach, is like, what's the simplest way to do something? And then how is music and sound going to enhance it? Sometimes people will start like a sound effect a frame or two before a scare beat, or people will do it right on the cut. That type of thing would be experimentation for me. The question I would always ask myself is, how is this grounded in the character's experience here? Are we ahead of the character or are we behind the character? How are we experiencing this through the character's eyes? And that's going to be, again, your lead up and then your reaction.
Hearing you talk about my philosophy is sort of to build up, start simple, and then just see if I can make it pay off without having to layer too much.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you about using surround sound to direct or misdirect the audience for a scare. And in watching Weapons, and again, maybe I missed this, maybe it was the quality of the theater I was in, but I didn't feel like you did that. I certainly want to know about your thoughts on surround sound in terms of jump scares, but in just editorial, are you working stereo, LCR? Do you do surround in post in your cutting room?
We had the capabilities to do 5.1 in our edits, and we were set up for that. Our sound team was definitely experimenting with us in the mix. Luciani Vignoli and Philippe Messiter, Luciani was our mixer and Philippe was our sound designer. We definitely were experimenting with some stuff in regards to that. So I think it's a really helpful device, but only when necessary.
Let's follow the sound thing a little further. I'd love to know about the Temp sound design process and also what you were using for Temp score. I believe Zach had a hand in the composition. Does that give you sort of a jump start in the scoring process when you begin editing?
So what's really interesting about our scoring process, like outside of our opening credit music with the George Harrison with the kids running, which was in the script, and a couple other tracks that Zach had mentioned specifically in the script that they wanted to license, he wanted to watch the movie without any score when he first saw the assembly. Sometimes when I'm cutting, what I'll do is I'll have some stuff I use for Temp just to help me find the rhythm of a scene. But otherwise, our first cut, and I'll pull all that out before I show Zach, so it'll be completely without music, just sound design elements. And that'll be just like Temp stuff, just for stuff we need for story purposes. Like if there's a gunshot or if there is like a stabbing noise or something like that, it's not necessarily creative sound design. So we watched the movie like that. And in this particular film, we were lucky enough to start with Ryan and Hayes Holiday as our composers really early on in the process, and Zach was composing with them. So we never really had Temp music in the cut. It was stuff we would start to get cues from the composers and try them out, and then the composers would get notes and do revisions for us, and we worked with our music in that manner. We did some temping because we had a screening coming up for the very last section of the film. The last like 10 minutes, what has like a lot of action and other moments that is a pretty complicated composing area that we just didn't have time to finish. But in general, the composers were demoing for us basically throughout the editorial process, which was fantastic. You really want to avoid getting Temp love. And when you have Temp music that you become really attached to, a lot of times what ends up happening is that you ask your composers just to mimic that. And again, that's not a terrible thing, but I think that in our case, it was more contributive to the film to struggle with and try to find the unique voice of the film from the beginning, musically at least.
I'd love to talk about the open of the film because I find the open of films and shows, you reveal a lot about the process.
Yeah.
In this case, we start with an unseen narrator. It's a little girl saying, "This is a true story," which is always creepy. And she explains what is happening over a montage of the kids running away. And, earlier you had mentioned like, listen, I got to be mindful of the audience's patience with things. And I just want to make sure that I get the context and the exposition out of the way expeditiously, which you do. I'd love to know about how that open might have evolved and the choices going into that open. And I'll ask, even though you're going to say like, that's up to you, but who is that kid supposed to be?
Yeah, I definitely I'm gonna defer to Zach on that one, or just the audience. Like, it's kind of more fun if you don't, whatever your interpretation of that is.
I knew you were going to say that.
That was in the script, that section and that voiceover. As a side note, the voiceover at the very end was something that Zach added later on in the editorial process. That was after we had gone through some feedback screenings and we were trying to figure out, he wanted to give the audience something that was just a little bit more to take us out of the movie. And I think it's very fun and really interesting language there to bring that voiceover back at the very end of the film. But yeah, I mean, that really was how it was scripted. I think we made a couple of line cuts here and there to that voiceover, and the other thing was trying to find the right flow for the kids and how that was going to, just working on that section with the montage to the George Harrison song. And, it took some experimentation and how many kids, how quickly we're cutting between shots, all of that. But nothing really deviated too much from the actual plan itself that was there.
In the Justine chapter, there seemed to be some sort of emphasis on drinks. Like there was a close-up of a Coke can, of a water bottle, a glass of whatever booze Justine was drinking.
Yeah.
Is there something to that, or is that just, no, sometimes you're just paying too close attention to the wrong things?
No, I mean, I don't think there's anything specific to the drinks itself, but I do think that Justine has a drinking problem. So I don't think that the shots of those various drinks is necessarily telling that story. It's interesting. I never really saw it like that, but I do think like the big hurdle for her character and one of the things she struggled with is alcohol.
So there's a scene where Justine's hair gets cut by Alex's mother. Justine's asleep in her car, and Alex's mother comes out and cuts a lock of her hair, which by the end of the movie, you know what's significant about that. But did Gladys ever use it? I don't recall there being a payoff from that.
There's a lot going on in the kitchen scene between Gladys, Marcus, and Marcus's partner, but she does pull out a piece of blonde hair from her purse before Marcus runs to the gas station. So that's in essence supposed to be Justine's hair, but if you missed it, you missed it. Hopefully that didn't take away from your enjoyment of the film.
No, I saw it, but I thought that she would have to control that. She would use that to control Justine.
Well, remember, she cuts Terry's hair, his partner, and then she snaps the stick, and Marcus goes to attack him. So, Gladys is magic.
Joe, I told you, I had my eyes closed through a lot of the movie.
Which is fine. Again, listen, I don't think anyone's supposed to get everything when you watch something. It's but hopefully, again, these things that if they trip you up, it's not something that makes the film less enjoyable. When I talk to someone else, I'll see a film, we see the same film, and there'll be moments that I totally miss. I'm like, wow, I just didn't even see that at all. But, hopefully, again, it's not something that diminished your pleasure at all.
No, the net result is that I want to see it again and soon. I think one of the really fun things about having a hit movie is getting to see, you talked about seeing it in the theater and just enjoying the reaction of the audience in the theater, but also seeing the reactions online and people's theories about certain things. I mean, that's got to be a trip.
Yeah.
And one of the ones that gets brought up a lot is this vision of an assault rifle in the sky that Archer sees.
Yeah.
And I think Zach is leaving that open to everyone's interpretation, but you cut it. So whether or not he said anything to you, do you personally have an interpretation of that?
I'd like to leave that open for the audience to interpret as well. Because again, I think for me, I love the fact that people get into the forensics of all of this and this story, but I'm still most interested in the emotional component of the film. It's important the audience has their own opinion on stuff, So, So I don't mean to defer, but I am going to defer.
It's totally fair game. I'd like to talk a little bit about the challenge of pacing the film, and you brought this up previously, because 1 hour in, we know where the kids are. That's the big mystery and who's responsible. It goes from a whodunit to how's it end.
Yeah.
Did you play with the timing of that reveal at all? The notion of giving the audience that much info when you did.
What was interesting about this, going into the movie, the one thing I did think about before we started cutting, I was, just knowing that we had this multi-chapter structure with scenes that replay and all that stuff. I was thinking that we were going to be doing a lot of experimenting with moving scenes around and between characters in the movie, and that pieces of the puzzle would take a while to figure out. But we briefly experimented with some structural changes in our director's cut process, and what we quickly found out was that, like a house of cards, when you move something to one place, while it may have been a really cool moment to experience in the micro, looking at it in a longer stretch in the movie, it was undercutting a lot of other moments that would be happening later. So the only thing we really did do was figure out how we can get to that reveal of the kids faster by making some prescient trims throughout the prior chapters, in particular to Justine. Her chapter is, I think, hers and Alex are the two longest. With her chapter, I think there was we didn't, again, it wasn't like cutting out wholesale scenes, but there were moments of how can we cut a few lines of dialogue out here and there? Like, how do we sharpen this? How do we work on the pacing of that chapter? And, the same thing happened in both Paul's and James's chapters as well, where we had some replay of scenes between Paul and James that happened in both chapters. For instance, in the Paul chapter, we see the entire police chase where Paul drives, and we go into the back of that empty lot in the back of that factory area with the brick building in the background. In the James chapter, while they did shoot that, we ended up cutting that much shorter, and we cut out a big chunk of James running, and we come back post-punch and just focus on James for the very tail end of the scene where Paul tells him not to go to the police station and that he's going to take the handcuffs off. So we employed some strategies along those lines to help us get to the reveal of the kids in the basement sooner. So that was something that was on our minds, where we wanted to bring that up actually in the overall experience of watching the film to make sure that we got to that reveal sooner. And it also was watching those chapters, these things needed to come out. It wasn't just for that purpose, but something that actually can be helpful for people to, particularly when they're starting out cutting features, is you really need to watch your films, and I mean that watching from start to finish to understand how things are working, to feel out the pacing, to feel out if you've taken out a shot, how it affects and trickles down for the rest of the movie. I think a mistake you may make is you've seen it so many times, you really think you can understand, I just kind of made these trims in this scene and it'll just work. And maybe it will, but to really understand the film and what the experience is, you need to watch a long run of it. It may not be always the entire movie, for instance, but, say, for instance, if you're making adjustments to the end of a film, you really want to give yourself a nice long run-up to see if you did anything to the pacing at the end of the film. Did you change it in some way that makes it not satisfying? For instance, you think you need to pick up the pace of the action when you get to the end of a movie, and you could cut it on its own. And on its own, you watch it, and you're like, this is fantastic. And then you watch 30 minutes prior up to that, and it's completely bonkers, whatever you just did, and you feel nothing, That's one of the challenges, is that I think watching the film again and again, and through repeated viewings, I think we kind of got to understand how this particular film wanted to work and what the pacing of the film wanted to be. And that was what informed some trims that we made to get to that point of that reveal in the film, kind of around the midpoint.
Well, I've asked you about, and you have answered, questions about the challenges of pacing and of structure. Let's bring it right down to the scene level. What was the most challenging scene to get right for you?
That's really interesting. I can tell you the most fun scene to work on for me.
That works too.
The scene of Gladys coming over to Terry and Marcus's house and into the kitchen was one of the most fun scenes to cut. I mean, there were a lot of setups. I don't remember how many letters we went to in our setup count, but it was, definitely more than 20, maybe 30. And, a lot of action to keep track of. But the actors were just so on point for that scene. And in particular, with Amy Madigan, who plays Gladys, we had a number of takes to get the camera right, for instance, on the entrance to the house. But every take, she was giving something really brilliant in her performance. And it was very difficult to choose with her, actually. And I think one of the things that Zach and I did was, it was trying to figure out in the edit, how to shade some of her performance beats, because she gave such great options. And it was a really fun scene to work on, just because it had both the challenges of working with some great performances while also coordinating some really specific action moments, then figuring out how to sneak in Gladys's magic and making sure that we kind of understood, this is the first time we're seeing her work with the stick, and timing those jokes around, say, one of my favorite lines about, bowl of water, for instance, how we're finessing the timing of that, and is that landing, so stuff like that. So I think that would be one of the areas that I really enjoyed putting that scene together. And, it had challenges, but the challenges were the fun challenges,
Well, I can see why you brought it back to fun, because this looks like a movie that would have been really fun to cut, despite how scary it is for a lot of people, myself included. So I thought a way to close out would be to ask you, and you started things off by talking about the birds. I'll ask you, what is the scariest movie you've ever seen?
Oh, that's so tough. Scariest movie I've ever seen. I would say that, and I would think this is more as a child, I would say the scariest movie. The first time I remember watching a really scary movie was The Exorcist.
Oh, yeah.
And I think, especially as a kid, not so much the devil stuff in The Exorcist that was terrifying, it was the medical scenes, watching her in the hospital and just like, having her head examined and all that stuff. I hope I'm remembering that correct, but but definitely at least that's stuck in my mind. I think The Exorcist for me would have been one of the scariest. But again, that's I haven't seen it in a while, and that's definitely like something that but definitely stood out to me as like a terrifying film.
Well, that's a good answer. That's a good answer. I would think anybody listening would think my scariest movie was Weapons. It's actually Beaches. Yes, I still have nightmares about watching Beaches. I think it was Barbara Hershey's lip injections that did it. Scary stuff. But if you want the good kind of scary, then Weapons is the movie for you. Clearly, it was the movie for a lot of people because it has been dominating the box office this summer. Congratulations and a big thank you to Joe for cutting a really cool movie and then coming on the podcast for a really cool conversation. As always, I hope you enjoyed it. Are you looking to make it big in the world of editing? Are you looking to make it small in the world of editing? Maybe I should just ask, are you looking to make it in the world of editing? Like I said, it's a tough business and getting tougher by the day. But a great way for you to survive and thrive in that business is to have your editorial skills sharpened on Avid Media Composer. It's Joe Murphy's weapon of choice in the cutting room, and it will also serve you well. You heard Joe talk about how ScriptSync helped him tame his timeline for Weapons, but there are so many other great tools for you to use within the industry's most trusted, most enduring nonlinear editing platform. And the best way for you to start your journey with it is to check out the Media Composer page on avid.com. As always, I have left you a free ticket for that ride in the show notes. All you got to do is click it. As for me, all I got to do is get out of here today. I'm afraid I have some business that needs attending, so we're probably going to have to skip a week on the podcast. But that's okay. Use that hour I have given back to you wisely. Of course, I advise you to use it learning more about Media Composer, but it is also not a bad idea to use it to relax with family and friends. However you spend it, I look forward to getting back together with you soon to meet some more cool editors. Until then, this is Matt Fury thanking you for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.